you finish filing all of your edges, perfecting from the top view and then rounding from the side view, you'll be able to move on to sanding. So sanding is when you start dealing with the surface of your metal, so the flat sides. Okay, so you may have noticed that over time, your metal started to get a little gross and grimy, especially the copper. The copper will oxidize, so when it's exposed to the air, it just goes through natural chemical reactions where it starts to change colors and get kind of brownish, sometimes greenish, depending on how long it's been out in the elements of the world. So also, some of you may have noticed you might have had some sort of Sharpie markings, especially if I was marking your metal, to help you just figure out which edges to kind of continue working on. So sanding is a nice way to kind of get rid of all that gunk and grime, perfect your edges on top, get rid of any scratches that you may have had. It also cleans your metal so that later when you go to solder, you have a nice clean surface to work with. So with sanding, there is a couple steps. You're going to be working with 4 different types of sandpapers. And the different types are just different grits. So the amount of roughness that the sandpaper has. So we have 100, 220, 320, and 400 grit sandpaper. So the numbers stand for how many little bumps, how many pieces of supposed sand is within a certain area. So the 100 is your roughest grit. So that means that there's 100 little speckles of sand within, let's say, a 1 by 1 inch square. Okay? The 220 has 220 of those little pieces within that same area. The 320 has 320 pieces, and 400 has 400. So the higher up you go in number, the more pieces of sand you have, the smoother the sandpaper is going to feel. So when you go to sand your piece of metal, you always want to start with the roughest sandpaper, so the 100. And what that does is it starts to get rid of the bulkiest amounts of tarnish, grime. It's meant to get rid of your bigger scratches. And from there, you'll kind of keep going up to the 220, 320, 400 to start to smooth everything out and kind of polish it almost. Okay? So here I have my 100. So the pieces of sandpaper are cut pretty much the same size. If you want to cut it down into a smaller piece that's a little more manageable, especially if you have small pieces of metal, you're more than welcome to kind of cut stuff down. But when you go to sand, you're going to sand on the table. And I suggest having a piece of paper, and I can put out some scratch paper for you guys. And the metal is going to sit on top of the paper, and that's what you're going to be sanding on top of. Okay, do not sand on the surface of the table. The surface of the table itself might scratch and ding up your metal. And you may have noticed that our tables aren't in the best shape, so there might be some weird bumps, maybe some sharper edges. The paper will protect it. So if you go to slide your metal around, nothing's going to happen to it on top of the paper. Okay. Also, our tables have kind of this glossy finish on them. If the sandpaper, if you start to sand into the table, it's going to take away that varnish, and then our tables just get a little worse for wear. So I have my 100. That's going to be the first sandpaper I'm going to use. Okay, metal. I'm going to work on one side first, and then I'm going to flip it and work on the other side. When you sand, you're going to be sanding both sides of all your pieces of metal. Okay. So when you sand, you always want to be sanding in one direction. Okay, so right now I'm just going to go just kind of up, down, motion. By doing so, you're going to get a very uniform sanding texture on your piece. Okay, all the lines are just going up, down, up, down. Okay? If you kind of move your sandpaper all over the place, you're going to get markings that are all over the place. They're not uniform. It's going to actually scratch up your metal more than help it. So make sure when you sand, you're sanding just back and forth in one direction. And you'll start to see the metal get a lot shinier and a lot cleaner just by using the 100. So you'll sand both sides of your metal with the 100. From there, you'll move on to the 220. So with the second piece of sandpaper, you're going to go in the opposite direction. So you can either go left to right, or you can just turn your metal and go in that up-down motion, whatever feels more comfortable for you. But the goal is that you're going in one direction, then the other direction. And then with the 320, you're going to go back in the other direction, and 400 back to the horizontal. So you're creating this layer, almost like a basket when you weave. And all of that is going to erase out all those markings. So 220. And then 320, I'm turning my metal. Because for me, it's more comfortable to just turn the metal than to try to sand in a different direction. And then 400 is my last one. You can also hear the difference between the different sandpapers. The 100 had a much louder sanding sound because it's really getting rid of a lot more of that gunky surface texture. And then the 400 is very, very soft. So even though I'm applying the same amount of pressure, you can hear the difference based on how much grit the sandpaper has. Questions? So sanding, once you finish filing, you'll be able to sand. With the sandpaper too, you can see that the sandpaper, I only use a little bit of it. So if you see that your sandpaper is still usable, you can put it back into the pots. Okay? Once the sandpaper starts to rip, tear, gets holes in it, gets really gross, then you can throw it out. But we want to try to reuse the sandpaper as much as we can, just so we're not wasting it. And also, when you are putting back pieces of sandpaper that you use, make sure they go back in the correct pot. I did label them with what grit it is, so that way you can easily put them back and know which ones you're grabbing. Overall, if you look on the back of the sandpaper, sometimes you might see the numbers. So here you can kind of see the 220, but other pieces you might not see it. So you can just kind of feel, and you should be able to tell the difference between the 4 different grits.